Welcome to Echo No More, clear, credible, court-ready documentation in high-conflict parenting. No hype, no legal jargon, no drama. I'm Dr. James. If you're new here, I'm really glad you found this space. This podcast is for protective parents navigating high-conflict custody situations, especially when the other parent is manipulative, emotionally unsafe, or unpredictable. I'm not a lawyer, and this podcast isn't legal advice. What I am is a parent who has lived through this system, and someone whose attorneys over and over again told me the same thing. Your documentation is excellent. They told me it made their job easier. They told me it protected my credibility, and they told me it changed how my case was received. That's why I'm sharing this. Not to teach you how to fight, but how to document calmly, clearly, and in a way courts actually understand. This is parent to parent, calm, grounded, and focused on protecting your child without losing yourself. This is one of the most emotionally charged topics for parents. And for good reason, because when it comes to your child, there is no margin for error. There is no area where parents feel more protective or more afraid of getting it wrong. And when documentation enters the picture, the fear often intensifies. Parents start asking, if I write this down, am I putting my child in the middle? If I don't write this down, am I failing to protect them? Where is the line between responsible documentation and harm? Those questions matter, and more importantly, they tell me something about you. They tell me you're not just thinking legally, you are thinking emotionally. You are trying to protect your child's experience, not just your position, and that matters more than anything. Let's start with something very clear here. Documenting child impact is not the same thing as involving your child in the conflict. Those two things are often confused, but they are not the same. The difference comes down to what role does your child play in the documentation? Courts are extremely sensitive to children being placed in adult roles. They are cautious, very cautious, of situations where children are acting as messengers, reporting on one parent to another, providing evidence, or feeling responsible for validating a parent's concerns. And rightly so. Children should not carry adult conflict. They should not feel like they are part of a case. They should not feel like what they say will be used somewhere later. Your role is not to turn your child into a source. Your role is to remain the observer. That distinction protects your child, and it protects your credibility. Here is where many parents, very understandably, get tripped up. They hear child impact matters, so they begin documenting everything their child says, long quotes, emotional statements, raw expressions, because they don't want to miss anything important. But here's the shift. Courts are not looking for a transcript of your child's emotions. They are looking for patterns in how your child is functioning. That is a completely different lens. It moves from, what did my child say, to, what am I consistently observing over time? Because what courts need to understand is not a moment, it's a pattern. So, what does that look like in practice? It looks like documenting observable change. Things that another adult, teacher, doctor, caregiver, therapist, could also reasonably notice. Changes in behavior, mood over time, sleep patterns, appetite, school functioning, transitions between homes, emotional regulation, regression or progress. These are grounded, these are measurable, and these are credible. And importantly, these do not place your child in the middle, because you're not asking your child to explain their experience. You are noticing it. The risk increases when documentation shifts from observation to interpretation. When entries begin to include assumptions about what the child is thinking, or diagnoses, or emotional conclusions, or repeated detailed quoting, that's where things become less clear and less reliable, because it moves away from what can be observed into what can be debated. And courts tend to be cautious there, not because your concerns aren't valid, but because interpretation is subjective. Observation is not. Now, let's talk about one of the hardest parts of this, child statements. Because children do say things that matter, and ignoring them completely doesn't feel right. So, the question becomes, how do you document what your child says without turning them into evidence? Here is the safest approach. You note that a statement occurred, when it occurred, and the context, and then you stop. You do not probe for more details, ask follow-up questions, revisit it later to clarify, or ask your child to repeat themselves. You are not collecting information. You are noticing something that happened. That distinction is critical, because courts are very attuned to documentation that feels coached or curated or rehearsed. They are much more receptive to documentation that feels incidental, restrained, and natural. There is another boundary here that matters deeply. Your child should not know they are being documented. Not directly, not indirectly. If a child begins to feel like their words are being remembered for a reason, their statements are being tracked, or what they say might matter later, they will begin to adjust. They may self-monitor, withhold, or feel pressure to say the right thing. This is not protection. Protection is allowing your child to speak freely, feel safely, and remain outside of adult concerns, while you quietly hold the responsibility of observation. There's another misconception we need to clear. Many parents believe documenting child impact means proving harm. It doesn't. It means documenting change. Change from baseline, change over time, change in response to specific conditions or transitions. Courts understand something very important. Children can be both resilient and impacted at the same time. They are not looking for collapse or perfection. They are looking for patterns, and patterns are built through calm, consistent observation. This is where language becomes incredibly important. Parents often feel, if I don't write this strongly enough, no one will take it seriously. But here's the paradox. The stronger the language, the more it can invite skepticism. The more neutral the language, the more it invites attention. For example, instead of, my child was extremely distressed and traumatized by the transition, you might document, child cried for approximately 20 minutes following transition and had difficulty settling into routine that evening. Same moment, different impact. One is emotional, one is observable, and the second carries more weight. I also want to say something that many parents don't hear enough. Sometimes, documenting less is more protective. If documentation turns into constant monitoring, scanning your child for signs, analyzing every reaction, it can shift your presence. And children feel that. They may not understand it, but they feel the attention, the tension, the subtle shift from connection to observation. Your child does not need to feel watched. They need to feel safe. Documentation should never come at the cost of connection. So let's bring this back to how this is received. Parents who document child impact effectively sound steady, not alarmed, not reactive. They sound like adults who notice change, track patterns, and remain grounded. That communicates something powerful. This parent is attuned, but not intrusive, concerned, but not escalating, protective, but not involving the child. And that balance is what courts trust. At the end of the day, your role is not to prove your child's experience through intensity. It's to reflect it through clarity. You're not building a case through your child. You're building a record around your observations of your child. That difference is everything, because it allows your child to remain where they belong, outside of the conflict. So, let me say this clearly, because many parents need to hear it. You can document your child's experience without putting them in the middle. You can protect your child without using them as evidence. You can stay aware without becoming hyper-focused. And you can hold concern without transferring it onto them. That is what balanced, credible documentation looks like. Before we close, I want to remind you of something important today. You don't need to capture every word your child says. You don't need to prove their experience through intensity. And you don't need to involve them to protect them. Calm observation is power. Before we close, I want to remind you of something important. You don't need to document everything. You don't need to be perfect. And you don't need to convince anyone with emotion. Calm documentation is power. If this episode helped you, you will find a full structured system in my guide, Clear, Credible, Court Ready. It's designed to support, not replace, your attorney. And if you want help turning everything you're documenting into something organized and usable, you can visit www.echonomorecoaching.org to download my guide on how to create a clear, court-ready documentation binder. Take what helps, leave what doesn't, and most of all, take care of yourself. I'll see you next week.